Hey everybody, it's Damien Gergiev from the Break It Down Show, and today's guest is Jack Hues. Jack Hues, the singer-songwriter and composer best known as the frontman for Wang Chung, has today announced the release of his second solo album, Electro-Acoustic Works 2020. This was written and recorded during the national lockdowns along with a series of shows for September 2021. In standard times, Jack would have spent most of 2020 performing in the USA and Europe, promoting his first solo album called PRIMITIF, but as the pandemic shut the world down, Jack set his living room up as a studio and began writing and recording ideas. Get to jackhughes.com to learn more about Jack's tour dates and music. If you want to support the Break It Down Show, go to breakitdownshow.com and donate to the PayPal link, or you can simply subscribe to any podcast platform. You can buy our merch or watch our videos for free on YouTube. Don't forget to donate to our veteran friends at savethebrave.org. We fight together PTSD. Alright, here comes Jack Hues.
Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay
This
Moore.
is Greg Proops.
This is Jordan Harbinger.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This is
East.
Sebastian Younger.
This is Rick Marotta.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
Hey, this is Skunk Baxter.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
Hi, I'm Jack Hues, and you're watching The Breakdown Show.
And now, The Break It Down Show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
Yeah, Jack Hues. Everybody knows Jack Hues because he was the front man for a band called Wang Chung, and an internationally famous band, a world famous band, actually probably more than anything an American famous band, but we like to think of ourselves as important as the world.
Yeah.
But you wrote some songs that will stay with us for the rest of our lives and probably outlive us by many centuries. So the thing that we're intrigued by, though, Pete and I, is that you have carved for yourself quite a career as a songwriter, and you survived pop superstardom that has been the undoing of many.
Yes.
And somehow you've not just survived it, but thrived from it. Your latest release comes out in September,
Mm-hmm.
and you wrote it during the pandemic.
Yeah.
So we're very interested in that, and I just want to tell our listeners it's a rock album. There are horns. It's the very mature compositions. You've always written very mature compositions and very, clearly an educated musician, not just a pop star.
Sure.
But this I think is a rock album, whereas many of us know your work as having a lot of synth stuff. But I would say your native instrument is guitar, is it not?
It is. Yeah. I started playing guitar when I was 8 years old. So
Wow.
I'm still practicing,
Okay.
But yeah, that's the instrument I feel most comfortable with.
Yeah. Well, as Pete told you before we got on the air, I'm the drummer in a British rock band called the Uncommonwealth, and we play from all the British invasions.
Cool.
And of course, we play "Everybody Have Fun Tonight," but I am partial to Dance Hall Days.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's the more British sounding song, I guess.
Which one of the two do you like better?
I like them both. I think Dance All Days was an earlier track when we were based in London. Certainly, it was the track that got us signed to Geffen Records in Los Angeles and made that transition for us. Yeah. But I think it sort of has a sort of British sound to it, if you like. With Everybody Have Fun Tonight, we recorded a lot of that album in Los Angeles. We were working with a producer called Peter Wolf, who Peter had all kinds of hits with all kinds of people, including We Built This City on Rock and Roll around the same time as he had Everybody Have Fun Tonight. So, so it's a more of an American sound, I guess. But I think they're both good. Sorry, I've got some message coming up here. Yeah. No, I enjoy them both. And more importantly, the crowds enjoy them both.
And that really affords you a lot of freedom to be the artist that you want to be now. I mean, you have to. When we were talking to Andy Summers, he's very artistic. He doesn't have to make music that is popular in terms of pop music, right? He gets to make what he wants to make. And so, because for him specifically, he said he is on the frontier of art from his perspective. Like there's no one ahead of him. That's his job, is to push the boundaries.
Cool.
Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, I guess it does actually. Yeah. Yeah, I can get that with Andy, you know, because obviously he has strong jazz influences and he's playing, and you know, he made a great album of Thelonious Monk tunes, and yeah, great. So I can get that. You know, I think some musicians are in it for the music. You know, I know everybody seems to think, oh, people are in it for the money. You know, but there's plenty of other things you could do if you wanted to make money. So. I think with music, it is a constant learning process. And if you're in that space where you want to learn, where you're constantly finding new music that inspires you, then yeah, I agree with Andy. You're sort of on your own cutting edge.
I think well, I want to go back to what you just said about being in it for the music, because with a lot of artists who are in it for the money, that's the undoing. You know, they get caught up in the trappings, and I think you were famous for really just sort of continuing to have a really normal life and not driving a Ferrari. What was with that?
Yeah, my manager encouraged us to have a pension fund rather than a Ferrari, so that was good. Not exactly rock and roll, but sensible, you know. Yeah.
You had a great manager. So, but you guys, when you signed to Geffen at the time, you had a deal with Arista first of all, right?
Yeah, we did. Yeah.
And they wanted to drop you. And so, how did the deal with Geffen materialize?
Well, I think Arista were in two minds. You know, we released our first album with Arista, this album called Wang Chung, which was how we spelled the name of the band in those days. Yeah. And essentially, you know, for record companies, they are in it for the money, and that didn't really make the money they expected it to do. So they were in two minds, you know. But I think they wanted to make a second album. I think that was where the critical thing came, really, you know, because they were willing to take us on for another album. And most bands would kind of, you know, better than Bird in the Bush or whatever it is, Bird in the Hand.
Yeah.
So, but we had a new manager at that point, David Massey, and David was absolutely sure that we should sign to an American label, feeling that the sort of musicality that we had would never really work in Great Britain. And which isn't to say we couldn't have hits and stuff, but I totally understood what he was saying, you know? And I think when we signed to Geffen, and particularly when we went to Los Angeles and met people there, it was a whole different vibe, and they really did understand the music. And I think in those days, there was a sort of sense of Wang Chung being like a sort of new wave Steely Dan in a sense, you know. In fact, there was a time when we were going to think about working with Gary Katz, who produced a lot of Steely Dan stuff, you know. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that was an interesting set of possibilities. You know, the life in the music business is full of interesting possibilities. You know?
Yeah,
I'm curious when you hear stuff like you're like the you know, British Steely Dan. One of the things that it's interesting to me, and I'm kind of just formulating this thought, but some bands get America and they make it, and we get them. Some bands come to America and they don't. We don't get them. And the same is true going the other direction, right? Like we had Suzi Quatro on, right? She's from here, but she made it over there. You know, we didn't know who Jimi Hendrix was until you guys figured it out for us, you know, right?
Very good example.
Yeah. What is it? Paul Weller is another one that I always talk about. You know, he's fantastically successful in Great Britain, but you know, just pissed off the wrong people, including himself, you know, and it's never really found a firm footing here. What is it about a band like you guys were able to do it on both sides? How do you figure that out?
Yeah, if I knew the secret, I could probably sell it. You know, I'm not sure what it is. It's maybe a certain sense of sensibility. I think in the UK, you know, the music business was always very fashion oriented. And so you've got to have that bit of it down, you know. And they, not so much the people, but the press intrinsically distrust professionalism in music. You you know. So if you look like you know what you're doing, they're suspicious that you've got some sort of key and you're cheating somehow, you know what I mean? And they prefer their rock stars to be heroin addicts, leather jackets, and a mess, you know. And fair enough. Out of that comes a lot of great creativity. But I think in the States, I don't know whether it's still the case, but certainly the media in the States, and particularly the DJs, they expected bands to be professional and to be musically adept, educated, and to be interested in the business in a properly applied kind of way, you know. So pretending that you couldn't care less about everything. Oasis are a good example, you know, who kind of were massive in the UK, but their attitude didn't translate at all into the States, you know, even though the music should have been huge, you know. So I think you got this kind of, as it were, when I got to LA, I realized that people in the music business and LA really treated it like a business. They were very serious about it. They knew a lot about it, and they were very kind of turned on by that thing. Do you know what I mean? It wasn't just wanting to get laid or stoned or whatever else. Not that they didn't want to do that, but you know, it wasn't quite as high on the list as it was for the English guys.
Yeah, thanks for the clarification on that. I just want to properly shout out your new album coming out September 3rd. It's called Electro-Acoustic Works 2020. It was the album created during the pandemic. And I want to talk about the influences of that. But I must one last time go back to Dance Hall Days because for two reasons. Number one, because one very interesting thing that you and I have in common, we both have fathers who were sax players.
All right.
And that we kind of cut our teeth playing with our dads.
Okay,
which that's an experience that I, at the time, protested, but would not ever trade for the world now.
Yeah.
How much of that influence still remains in you?
Strong, you know. My dad was, as you say, saxophone player. He was a jazz musician. I guess he really got into music. So he was in a military band, you know, like right after the Second World War. So like around between like 1948 and 1950. Mm-hmm. He had to do national service, and he did that in the military band. And
way to do national service.
He did it in the UK, but they were actually in Berlin at the time. So I think this around the time of the Berlin airlift, and so all pretty kind of intense stuff.
Yeah.
But as a result, I think my dad's attitude to music, which was the attitude of a lot of his contemporaries, was that music was like being in the military. You know, so it was you were as good as your last gig. You know, if you were on time for a gig, you were late. You know, the loyalty to your band members came before absolutely anything, almost before your wedding day, sort of thing, you know. So he had this very sort of disciplined approach to it, you know. And I think he never really understood how I made money as a musician, because I never seemed to be gigging. I was always in the studio making records, you know, and that, which is what I love doing, you know. So I think he was always a little confused about what I was doing, you know. So there's always that thing, you know, and there's part of it's, you know, it's full of love and mutual admiration, and part of it's kind of, there's a sort of antagonism there, you know. So, but I guess growing up, you know, there was jazz in the house, and when I heard the Beatles for the first time, that really did go, you know, this is my music, and my parents don't get it, and that was very important to me, you know, to define my own sort of place in the musical world.
Yeah, that's rock and roll, right? Whatever makes your parents uncomfortable is rock and roll. Another bass player we had on the show, he was an interpreter for me in Iraq, and he talks about how his dad made him go out and, you know, play keyboard, play the bass, and he would book gigs for them in Kuwaiti malls. And he was like, it was great to go out and play, but I didn't want to play these. Like, these are not gigs that you want as a musician, right? So do you have similar things? Your dad's influence was like, oh man, like,
yeah,
you know.
No, I totally get it. And similarly, you know, I played in my dad's band. It was, I mean, looking back on it, it was an incredible training, you know, because I was working with these obviously much older guys. I was literally 12, 13, that sort of age when I was playing bass in his band, you know, and all these guys were, well, they seemed like incredibly old to me, but I guess they were like 30 or something. And, but yeah, sort of keeping up with them. and learning to read the charts. That was the thing, you know. It was all, I didn't know the music, so you had to read the charts. The bass parts I could read, the guitar parts were tougher. But as I got older, I sort of started getting the guitar parts. But it meant that I grew up, you know, surrounded by musicians, listening to other musicians play. And I think in rock bands, that's one of the things you have to be able to do. You have to be able to sort of react almost instantaneously and, you know, be able to sort of fit in with whatever vibe is going on and try and enhance it, of course.
That's what made you guys the Steely Dan of new wave, I think. your ability to hear everybody else, listen to everybody else. And then if you'll indulge me, I must nerd out on the song Dance Hall Days because I love dotted subdivisions. And so how did you lay the drums for that? How much of that was machinery? How much of, if any of it, was live? What did you do?
Well, it was a Linn drum that we were using.
It was a Linn drum, okay.
And it was very hard to defeat the natural way the drum machine works in 16s.
Yeah.
You know? So I forget how we did it because it's not just like straight triplets, it's somewhere else, you know.
Right.
You know, we all, Nick and I and Chris Hues as well, were all massive fans of Little Feat and how they would get that sort of...
Wait a minute, did Chris Hues work on that with you?
Chris Hues produced it, yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
That explains a lot.
Yeah. Well, that was one of the things that we wanted to work with him because the Burundi thing with the Adam and the Ants records has that same slightly sloppy kind of
just a little swung.
Yeah. So he understood that, and he understood how it wasn't just a question of programming triplets or, you know, putting a tempo, you know, in some mathematical relationship to make it all work. You know, it was a feel thing essentially, you know, and it took forever to get it, but we got it, or some version of it anyway.
Yeah, I want to say for our listeners, if you don't know, we've had a couple of episodes with Chris Hues. He's a hero of mine as a drummer and a producer, and for the contemporary listeners who get this reference, he was Jay Dilla before Dilla, and the ability for him to take a Linn drum and figure out a way to swing it just a little bit really says a lot. What were you saying, Pete?
I was going to say we've had Chris on the show a couple of times. That, you know, he's more than an acquaintance, maybe a little less than a friend. Not that we're not friendly with him, but John had a question for him, and I love this story, so I thought we'd relate it to you. But John tells it better than I do. So, John, will you tell the Chris Hues drum part story?
Well, you know, I'm trying to endure playing "Everybody Wants to Rule the World," and I'm having a hard time, you know, just riding out the triplet all the way through. I mean, that's a feat of endurance. So I asked him, you know, hey, what would you consider for a shortcut? You know, should I play it in eighth notes? Should I what? And he just essentially said, just fucking play it. Just cut it out and fucking play it, which is, you know, probably an answer that would have come from our dads too.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Stop thinking and play. Yeah.
I want to ask another question on new wave, and I'm curious. I asked Chris this. We asked another artist recently. When people say new wave, first off, you get kind of typecast, like especially you, like you're sort of bound by this genre, but it doesn't at all. Like you listen to music, and it's like, yeah, you've had some new wave elements, but you're not a new wave musician. I wouldn't say. What is new wave? I know it when I hear it. Like the Go-Go's are punk and they're new wave and all these other things. When we look back at genres, it kind of doesn't make a lot of sense. And you guys, for sure, Dance Hall Days, Have Fun Tonight, even Live and Die in LA, these are hit songs and they sound new wavy, but I don't know. Like I know when I hear, I can describe the blues, I can describe funk, I can describe like, this is why this is disco and not funk. What is that with new wave? What makes something a new wave song?
I'm always in two minds about this whole genre thing, you know, because in a way, I think it's looking at music from the wrong end of the telescope. You know, you're sort of looking usually at like a sort of bunch of bands who come from a similar time frame, maybe a similar place in England, you know, and seeing the similarities and saying, well, here, let's call it this new wave, jazz, or whatever you want to call it, and then you try and fit the artists into that thing, you know, and the artists, of course, are doing their own thing, as you said in the earlier part of the conversation. You're trying to define yourself and you're on your own cutting edge, you know, and even when you're being slotted into the genre, and I guess you're aware of the spirit of the time, and the spirit of the time, was obviously Lindrums, it was PPG wave synthesizers, it was the Fairlight, all those things contribute to the physical sound, But I guess there's a sensibility as well. And I guess the thing that to me unites those bands was, we all came out of the punk thing in a way. We all would have been cutting our teeth when punk was the big thing. And then with punk, it was very unfashionable to like even the Beatles. They were considered way too sort of sell out musical, like a boy band or something, but I think all of us new wavers had this closet sense of we were huge Beatles fans. We probably also liked American bands like Little Feat and Todd Rundgren and the Beach Boys, and so the new wave thing in a sense was bringing that kind of as it were multi-layered musical thing and trying to stick it into the punk sensibility that we were coming out of, where there was quite a lot of attitude and quite a lot of aggression almost, but trying to sort of mix that with the, for want of a better word, that sort of musical qualities, the art qualities that you get on Beatles records and Beach Boys records.
And you had a new technology that it seemed needed to be mastered by somebody.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was absolutely the beginning of computer music, or so like Lindrums, and you were definitely working with multi-track tape. So, rather than when you look at the Beatles output and it's like, this track is like take 18 and this is take 37, there's no take 37 at Dancehall Days, there's just the one track that we were working on that we built up, through layering it and layering it on the premise that if you got every layer right, the totality would be great, which in retrospect I think was mistaken. I think it adds a certain amount of sterility to it actually, but these days I much prefer playing in a more live kind of version, and if possible, obviously it's not possible these days, but if possible to play with the musicians together in the room.
But now that you've sort of pushed away from the classification, and your music has outlived the newness of the technology, how would you classify Electro-Acoustic 2020? What box do you put that in?
Well, I've always consciously tried to make it not in a box, and each track, in a sense, points in different directions. So I guess the first track, which we released as a single, is We Gotta Work Together. And that, to me, consciously evokes the sort of 1970s sense of kind of funk and rock that you might get on, say, a Buddy Miles album,
it's greasy.
Yeah, so I wanted to kind of get that. The tracks that come after that are much more like a sort of 70s prog type thing. So I think the 70s prog element is a strong one, and that's sort of what I grew up with really, and what I still adore. Yeah, I love those old albums, but I also wanted to get a sort of Miles Davis element in there. So there's a couple of tracks that are really led by the trumpet, and I know to some people that means trumpet means jazz, so when you're thinking in this genre driven thing, it's like, well, what's Jack doing? He's made a rock record with jazz on it, and it's all, but to me it's like the trumpet's got a certain kind of expression and it leads you in a certain direction, and then the rock elements pull you in this direction. To me, it's like trying to create an interesting meal, if you like, maybe with a few different ingredients from different countries.
Yeah, I'm glad you use that simile, because I think of it that way too. And I think that a lot of younger listeners, and my experience is limited to my kids, and they had a lot of exposure. So what I'm seeing of them now is that they don't have the same sort of genre. I mean, those were our identifiers. That was our virtue signals when we were kids. Yeah, and now there's a lot less of that. So they're not afraid to see an artist who maybe came up in one genre, but is unafraid to explore something else.
I get that. Yeah. And that's an important point, I think, because certainly, the records you carried under the LPs you carried under your arm to a friend's party said a lot about who you were in those days, and And maybe being young, you were much more, or I was anyway, much more narrow about my taste and stuff. But I think the great thing about streaming these days, and obviously there's lots that's not great about streaming for musicians especially, but the great thing in terms of consumers is there's access to absolutely everything. And so that can only be a good thing, I think.
Yeah, I just want to once again shout out Electro-Acoustic 2020 is the new album. It comes out September 3rd. Now, aside from We Gotta Work Together, which is on YouTube, everybody can go listen to that track. That's your sampler. The rest of the album's not out yet, but I really encourage everybody to buy it on vinyl.
Yes. Vinyl.
Make sure you buy it on vinyl. Jack has gone to great lengths to press this thing on vinyl and to preserve the fidelity of this great record, because it's important to do. And not only is it important to do, but you guys don't have any place to press vinyl there anymore.
No, the UK doesn't have anything. So we're having it pressed in a place in the Netherlands, which is super great. It's called Deep Grooves, and they kind of have a carbon neutral emphasis in the way they approach it. Obviously, vinyl's not a terribly friendly substance, but they do a lot of offsetting and stuff. And they're good guys actually, and they're very kind of committed to maintaining the high fidelity of the album. And so with this album, I recorded it here at home, like in this very room that I'm sitting in, so not in a studio as such, although I did record the drums in a real studio. But I tried to get the fidelity of it as good as I could, and I actually played it to a couple of, actually 4 or 5 friends who sat in this room and listened to it on my hi-fi system, and they were blown away by what they said was the clarity of it, And again, I think maybe people aren't so used these days to listening to music in that hi-fi kind of way. You get very used to listening on a little Bluetooth speaker, or even quite a good Bluetooth speaker, but that's still not hi-fi, So having a good turntable going through a nice warm amp and blasting out through speakers, that's the way to hear it.
Yeah, speakers that are encased in wood.
Yes.
Yeah, the difference between those types of experiences are, I would liken to I don't know, maybe smoking a cigar, where it's a commitment. You have to, if you decide you're going to listen to this album on vinyl, you have to kind of commit. Yeah. And surrender to the experience. And I think you'll be paid back dividends.
Well, I think that's very true. It's there's a great book actually by a guy called David Hepworth called A Fabulous Creation. And I think the subtitle is How the Album Saved Our Lives, or something like that. And he basically dates the heyday of the album from 1967, Sgt. Pepper, and ending with Michael Jackson's Thriller in 1983, I think that was, or maybe 4. And he says during that time, the album was the way that you listen to and consume music, and how great that was for artists, because it gave you not just the single, it gave you all these different windows into the different ways they thought, and in some cases different members of the band stepping forward to give their view, as it were. And I really get that, and I see the album's a great way of artists, bringing their ideas into the world, if you like, in a fully rounded kind of way. Yeah, in a long form. Yeah. What albums did you attach to and continue to be influenced by? I think the Beatles' White Album was a massive album for me, and still continues to sort of define a lot of what I do. So the album that I put out as a solo album before Electro-Acoustic Works is an album called PRIMITIF, which is also a double album, and I wanted it to be a double vinyl album in a very deliberate sort of way. But other albums that spring to mind, I'd say David Bowie's Ziggy Stardust was. Yeah.
There's a lot of albums, I think, that come after Michael Jackson that I think are important to the album era in the way they were constructed. Things that come to mind. The Beastie Boys' License to Ill. I just came in and the DJ had a simple 45-minute set. He just pressed play and then left it alone. Dr. Dre's the Chronic. That's not something that you would ever just take one. You would let the whole thing play. There's all kinds of them where they were fully
Yeah,
contained
that was
piece.
definitely composed as an album. Yeah.
Sure.
Do you still compose an album like
I
that?
guess
What is that
David
process?
Hepworth's point was really about, as it were, the fashion for the listener. And I suppose once you got to CDs, the way people consume music was very much they would skip tracks, and also the CD format is kind of too long to sit and listen to in one listen, you know. Whereas the album is just about the right attention span thing, you know. So.
Yeah.
But I do
It gave you a natural intermission. Yeah.
Sorry, I missed
I
that.
also enjoy that you made it at home. And
Yeah.
one of the things that I got excited about was, you know, when I was a kid and my parents would travel, they would leave us at home. You know, when I was in high school, I was old enough not to burn the house down. So if they went away for a few days, they'd leave me at home. And then I would turn our living room into my rehearsal studio, and I'd invite the guys over, and we'd play. And I imagined your process to be like that, and COVID to sort of be like a long excuse to turn your house into that.
Absolutely right. Yeah. So what would normally be a living room for most people is, for me, a sort of studio environment. You know, a mixture of living room and studio environment, and it means Chris Hues, which is very strange. I'll call him back. But yeah, yes, the living room is my studio. I can sort of just down the thing. There's
All right.
Mac and the grand piano at the back there.
Nice.
Yeah.
Hey, I also want to.
I want to ask you about
Josh McGill. Let me just say that Josh McGill. You know, what we've seen and heard so far is fantastic, and I really identify with his playing because he's a great pocket drummer. He's a great accenter of things. He really takes seriously his job of not just holding down the time, but of making everybody else really sound great. And so I just wanted to tip my cap to him.
Well, that's very nice, and he'll appreciate that. You know, but he is a really great drummer, sort of cast in the old school. You know, as you say, he's a sort of supportive drummer rather than someone who sort of tries to come to the front. You know, they're really creative. You know, there's a track on the album called "Don't Waste Words," and when I took that into the studio, there was no drums on it at all, and I was thinking at first that I didn't really want to put drums on it, but I said to Josh, just play along with it and see what happens, you know. And he really came up with these really creative parts, you know, using a lot of ride cymbal and just toms and stuff, you know. So he's a, you know, very creative musician, great songwriter himself, actually. I don't know if you've ever heard any of his stuff, but he was in this band called Siddhartha, who are kind of Canterbury based, in a sense, even more 70s prog than I am. And even though they're like half my age. You know. So, they're really talented guys. And Josh is such a sweetheart as well. You know, so wonderful guys to work with.
Yeah, I'll be really interested to hear that because I sort of saw, you know, as I watched him play and listened to him play, he reminded me of, you know, we all have the influence of the old guy in our life who just manages to have a creative vocabulary and doesn't need to say much because he just says the perfect, most poignant thing right at the right time.
All right, cool.
Yeah.
Well, he has that.
when you
There
record
was a
at home.
comment. Oh, go Pete.
No, I was gonna say when you record at home, you have the ability to do everything right there at your fingertips, but you also lose the requirement to be better than what you're capable of doing, right? So how do you ensure that, you know, good and great you're stressing that, you know, because look, I talked to Chris and he's like, a lot of people just don't need me to produce anymore, but they do, because he's going to shove you out of your comfort zone and go, how is it over there? And you can always come back, but you need to get shoved out there. So how do you replace that vibe? How do you replace that magic that happens? Like U2 talks about when God enters the studio and something just comes to you. How do you do that when you're at home?
Yeah, that's a good question, you know. And certainly with Chris, I often had that experience. You know, I know that I sort of play better when Chris is around, you know, because I'm trying harder, and I sort of, in some probably slightly adolescent way, want to impress him, or I don't know quite what it is, but that's happening. But yeah, I think working here, what I try and do is, because what I'm most aware of is the possibility of not being spontaneous, that you can sort of get an idea and do take after take after take and all that stuff. And I try not to do that. I try and sort of just set the mics up and then go and have something to eat and then come in and sit down and do a take, and really try and get the vibe going rather than get it playing it absolutely right, And then in some cases, I push myself, like on Electro-Acoustic Works, the last track, I think, on side 2, which is part of this long extended 20-minute track, has got these guitar arpeggio things that I can't play, basically, So that took some practice to try and get those together, and then I just kind of, well, in a couple of places I did a bit of cheating and editing and stuff, but really I just tried to get those to work and to phrase in a natural way. So I guess it's pushing yourself creatively as far as you can.
I think that the difference between your work from the 80s and your work now is largely that the technology back then sort of was they were like handcuffs, golden as they were, and I would say that your music now breathes so much more and is so much more organic and sonic.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right about that. The technology was emerging, of drum machines, synths, and multi-track recording and all of that stuff. But it was still in its infancy, and it was difficult to handle, and it was very time-consuming to use it. Whereas now everything is much quicker, and I think in a way the way I write now is more organic. There are certain tracks like Don't Waste Words, for example, where I don't use a click track and stuff. I just play it naturally and let the tempo sort of ebb and flow a little bit, And I think all those things are really important in the way an album feels. And of course, in the 80s, it was all about click tracks and drum machines. And although that felt like a great release in a way from working with real drummers who could never stay in time and stuff, it was, it's always a balance, isn't it? And I've often said to people, I think in the early 80s, there was this sense that you could make the perfect pop record because the technology was there to allow you to do it, and there was this sense that everything had to be perfect, whatever that means, and I think that was kind of a restrictive way of thinking, whereas we should have played it a lot more free in a sense, but that wasn't the spirit of the time.
Yeah.
When you're talking about eighth notes, I want to nerd out on your writing process. And then does it come before the music or does it matter? Because you have an album out and you're like, oh, I can't promote this album, but I can go in the studio and write about Donald Trump, about a pandemic. All these things are just writing themselves. You're not the first artist that we've had on the show that talked like there was just so much stuff. I had so much time. I had to make an album, So talk about the writing process.
Yeah. Well, with Electro-Acoustic Works, I actually got into, at the beginning of the pandemic, I did have this sense of like, this is great. I mean, I know it's dreadful for so many people, but for me, it was like, so I'm here in the house, I'm on my own most of the time. I really can do what I want, So I started listening to audiobooks. Like I'd have breakfast and then just listen to an audiobook for an hour, And I listened to a book on Ted Hues, who's an English poet and married to Sylvia Plath for a while. So, which was a very tempestuous, difficult relationship. But it was an incredible book about him and a great insight into how he wrote poetry, which is all about writing in the moment and about what's in front of him. It's not like imaginative in the kind. I mean, it's highly imaginative, but he's not making things up. Do you know what I mean? He's trying to describe what's there in front of him. So I tried to do that with the lyrics on this album, And certainly We Got to Work Together is just talking about what was happening on my computer. I don't have a TV, but you catch news on social media and all that stuff, and so trying to document that in a way. But I do sort of think that during the 80s, I was quite often led by the music, and then I try and get the words to fit around it. And these days, I'm much more led by the lyrics, and then I allow the music to try and bring up the emotion of those words.
Along those
And
same
do you have
lines, as a guy with a musical education, how much do you chart versus jam?
It's all jam when I'm working
Oh,
on my
good.
own. I chart for so the trumpet parts. I wrote out charts for that insofar as I needed them. But with that whole music education thing is interesting, because I think a lot of people think, if you can't read music, you don't know music theory, then you're a lesser musician. And I don't agree with that. I think, it's useful to do those things, but it's not essential. Having a good ear and having a powerful sort of emotional attachment to the music is the most important thing in rock music, that kind of area that we're talking about.
And do you play the mouth trumpet when you're writing the trumpet part? Like, do you go, do you do that, or is that in your head?
Yeah. It was kind of, well, initially that melody that the trumpet plays, I kind of sang it, and I was going to, Robert Wyatt, who's a very big artist over here, maybe not so much in the States, but he quite often vocalizes a melody, doesn't have lyrics and stuff, and I love how he does that. But I couldn't make up my mind about whether to do it like that or whether to get a real trumpet player in, So in the end, I found this great guy, Daniel Cano, who lives in Canterbury. He's from the south of Spain, but amazing player, really good, and he really nailed it. But I sort of kept my vocal in as well. I kind of like the two things together.
Well, you were in LA. You were signed to Geffen Records at the height of Wang Chung.
Yeah.
With a bunch of the studio guys around LA, and employed, the top studio session players, and book a big studio.
Mm-hmm.
Did you make it? I think my question is, did you make a Steely Dan record?
Well, I suppose you could maybe look at The Warmer Side of Cool, which is the last album that Wang Chung made, as a kind of a sub Steely Dan record,
Yeah.
There was a bit, we had Vinnie Colaiuta playing drums on it, and I forget, there was a guitar player who was on it for a while as well. I mean, the thing was that Peter knew, because Peter had been in Frank Zappa's band, he knew all of those those guys, who were either in
all those guys,
or Frank Zappa's band. So they were on hand. Patrick O'Hearn, the bass player, used to come and hang out in the studio a lot. Obviously, Nick was playing the bass parts in a slightly kind of, I'm the bass player kind of way. But that was good. And those guys are obviously amazing players. And that was one of the great things about working in LA, was having these guys around and having that sense of, musical excellence of that kind, being like nothing to be embarrassed about, which you sort of would be in London in a way. Do you know what I mean? You kind of keep it a bit quiet, So it's great, and the singers as well. I working with Saida Garrett, and she would work with Michael Jackson all the time, and wrote Man in the Mirror and stuff. And she sings on Everybody Have Fun Tonight, and she used to come to the studio and just hang out and sing on stuff. It's just wonderful, really great times.
So really, going to LA when you did was perfect for you.
It was, yeah.
Musically and otherwise.
I recently watched a movie called Laurel Canyon. I don't know whether you guys have had a chance to.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that made me feel
was great.
very nostalgic about LA, and even though we were there, I guess that movie goes up to about 1975, and we were there in '84, so it was kind of all over. But obviously, David Geffen was a big part of that scene, and signing to Geffen Records was kind of, there was some continuity there, And I've just bought the reissue of Deja Vu, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, and that to me is one of the greatest albums ever. Do you know what I mean? I adore that record because of the vibe and the playing and just the sound of it as well. It's just so beautiful. So yeah, but I being in LA at that time was wonderful. It was, it's quite different now. It's quite different now, as we all know, but back then it was quieter. It was still had this sort of strange mixture of urban and rural right next to each other, and Laurel Canyon really summed that up.
Yeah. I'm curious how much in your day-to-day life does music impact what you do? Like we had the DOC, who's a very notable rapper from the NWA and that kind of thing. And I was telling him that when I make a smoothie, I take his song, his tune, his words, and I turn it into, I get a smoothie, it's like, so there's always some kind of musical element in my day. And I'm not even, a musician. I can play the guitar a little bit and sing a little bit, but it's constantly around me. Right. And I just sort of let it flow right out of my mouth as it's in my head. Do you have a similar experience, or do you get enough outlet that you like quiet? I mean, how is that for you?
No, I mean, I have music on. No, I listen a lot to the classical station here in the UK. But if I'm not doing that, I bought a CD player because I had thousands of CDs. So I sort of just put one of those on. And basically, if there's not music coming at me, then there's music constantly playing in my head. I think people who know me sometimes think you just sometimes space out a bit during it. It's because I'm just listening to a bit of music in my head. It plays it's like having a photographic memory. Do you know what I mean? It's like so I just sit and listen to it. It's great.
Is that ever triggered by
made
sound?
your new record with your guitar in your hand?
Mm-hmm. Sorry again.
I was going to say, is that ever triggered by day-to-day sounds in your life? Like I was in a train station in Paris at, I don't know, Gare de l'Est or somewhere. And there was this alarm like, doo, doo. And I'm like, yeah, doo. And it would make like a tune for me, build into something. I wasn't doing it. My brain just does it, right? Does that trigger work for you?
Sometimes. I remember sitting in a concert hall, like waiting area one time, listening to the air conditioning unit playing this kind of chord that was like phasing slightly, and that was great. So yeah, you hear music in all sorts of places,
I was going to ask how you tracked the new record, because it is so vintage. You have a horn section. You made the record with your guitar in your hand. There's a lot of organic and breathing elements in the record. Did you track it to tape? Did you use Pro Tools? What'd you do?
No, I was using Logic actually.
Okay.
And which I think is really good. Recording 24-bit, 44.1.
Wow.
But I took it to a really good mastering place, Metropolis Mastering in London, and John Davis mastered it, and he sent it out through some really beautiful outboard gear, which I think makes the top end particularly great, and thumps the low end as well. So it gets a lot out of it, And I think listening to a lot of those sort of 70s records, I sort of got that in a way. The secret to getting a really good sound is not to have too many instruments playing, and so I suppose I approach it like that. There's a guitar part and a bass part and a keyboard part, maybe second guitar, but I don't layer it up too much, and I'm lucky to have some lovely guitars which give good focused sound, and a decent vocal mic and stuff, So it's just going for that sort of clarity and natural sounds. It just sounds pretty good, and I try to, if it was a trumpet part, then it's a real trumpet. The sax part is a real sax player. A friend of mine, Pete Grogan, who plays in a jazz band called Lead Bib, pretty out there, free jazz kind of thing. And then Baby and Solar, she sings on it, and she's just such an inspiring singer, So Pete and Baby, they did their parts in separate studios, and sent it to me. But I was, they're just great musicians, so they give you great energy, and great parts.
Now I really can't wait to hear the rest of the record, because I now have to imagine that it was tracked in different places, that everybody sent you parts and you put them together, because the record breathes in a way that it, what little we've heard of it so far, it doesn't sound like that. It sounds like it was all jammed and made in one room.
Yeah, well, I deliberately try to make it that way, and there are some tracks where I kind of there's one track called Slow Gears, which is the trumpet-led track, which sort of gets into this kind of jam. It feels like the track plays, and then the drums come in really quite late in the track, and the musicians just sort of go to a slightly different place. And I guess I just kind of felt that as I was here. It was like really late one night, and just played the guitar parts, and it really wasn't planned at all, but I'd sort of just left it for a few days and then came back to it, and just kind of got into what was there, and then worked around that. And again, Josh put the drums on quite late on the album, so he had stuff to play with, but he just sort of felt it, and that was very much how I really wanted it to sound, like, how did you get this to sound so live and like there's a lot of jamming going on when it was a lockdown album where you did a lot of it on your own, sort of thing. So that was the illusion I was trying to create.
Wow.
Got my buddy Cook has put a comment in here talking about how during our we were seniors in 1987, and during our trip to Disneyland, your music and your videos were playing on that trip, and that makes me think about this show right now called Lupin on, I think, on Netflix, and it's French, and there's a dog who's a character, and that dog's name is Jacques.
Okay.
And I can't believe that's on purpose, right? Like your cultural relevance seeps into all of these things in life. Do you ever just sit back and go, that belongs to me, that belongs to me? How on earth did you get, but there's things that you create that just you've managed to get over the top, and so you rain down in a lot of different areas.
Yeah, that's a great way to look at it. Obviously it isn't like that, but I love the idea that the dog is called Jacques. That's great.
Going back to that time period, you guys toured with Tina Turner.
Yeah.
Are there any nuggets of wisdom of hers that remain with you?
Well, I guess on the tour, she was never around, apart from one night when she came. I think she watched our set, or maybe she was just around towards the end of it. And she, we did photos together and all that stuff. I don't have them, sadly, but I would love to see those. But she would tend to, arrive in her limo like literally 3 minutes before she went on the stage, did her set brilliantly, and then came off the stage, back in the limo, back to wherever she went to, So she really did lead a very, she didn't participate at all in the extracurricular stuff that tours are made of, But one thing I do remember with Tina is doing Top of the Pops in the UK, and in those days with Top of the Pops, there was always this fight between the BBC and the Musicians Union. So the Musicians Union wanted the musician to play live and not have any recorded stuff, and the BBC wanted to have basically the musicians miming, because it was too complicated to set up all the gear for different bands and all of that stuff, And the record companies always wanted the bands to mime because, if the sound was bad, which it frequently was, then a band's career could just be torpedoed overnight, So anyway, at this particular time, we were doing miming to the backing track, but the lead vocals had to be live. So I was singing Dance All Days, which was reasonably nerve-wracking, but it's not a hard song to sing. But Tina Turner was there singing I Can't Stand the Rain, or whatever was the contemporary hit that she was having. And she sang live, and I've never heard a voice like it. It just completely, made me melt into butter. It was like such an incredible sound, and her presence and her whole kind of command of what she was doing is one of those things, I was a kid then, sort of didn't really know anything about anything, but that was one of those things where you thought, wow, it's like performing is something that I don't know anything about. Do you know what I mean? It's like I've got to get to that place, where I can command it in that way.
True master. How about the Cars? You toured with the Cars as well.
We did.
Was that experience any different?
Yeah, they were like a sort of art rock band. It was a great tour for us in the sense that they were selling out these massive stadiums night after night. So we were playing to 70,000, 80,000 people a night. And the stadiums were pretty full when we went on as the opening act. Because sometimes everyone's just in the bar until the opening act's finished up now, then they come in for the main thing. But people wanted to see us because we were new, and Dance All Days was a big hit and everything. And for me, it was all pretty stressful, I suppose, and a bit confusing. But the overall sense was the people, really got into our set. And then the Cars were great, but they had this policy of not talking to the audience, so they would play, whatever they played, one of their hits and stuff, the crowd would go wild and they would turn their back on the audience, for like 30 seconds. And then they turn around and start the next song. And you could feel that progressively picking off the crowd, And so people's experience at the end of it was kind of like, the cars were a bit boring, which they weren't. They were like meticulous in the way they did everything, But this stage thing was really, I'm sure it was an arty, well-intentioned decision, but it really wasn't working. The people's sense was that we were great and the cars were a bit boring. So that was fine.
But there are acts that have that reputation. I mean, the Cars were for sure known to be a boring act. New Order is known to be a boring act. Elvis Costello, I saw him live, but I'm like, this is just not great. He's playing every song a little bit faster to get through more songs. And then it's like, there's nothing in it. Like I can listen to the CD at home. Well, Debbie Harry came on before Elvis Costello and kicked his ass because she talked to the crowd. And, she didn't just play the hits. And I don't know what it is about musicians that make them want to have a show that isn't great. But when you have your reputation for 40 years and it stays the same, you're a great live act.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of musicians kind of don't want to be showbiz. Do you know what I mean? They want to be musicians and like an art thing, and I totally respect that. But I get also the people are there, they want to be part of it and they want to hear you talk inane stuff, like, is everybody all right, all that stuff, they want that. So I think knew the modern Wang Chung shows that I do with Nick. I haven't done them for a while, but we're planning on doing some once we're able to play again. They're very kind of immersive, cohesive things, and the audience is such an important part of it all. It's no good just playing at them. You've got to kind of involve them in it as well.
Yeah. Man, I really enjoyed this chat. It's so much fun.
Me too.
Yeah, and it's completely okay for you to say that you took the road with the Cars and you knocked them out.
I guess that is what I'm saying.
We applaud that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. I saw Jeff Beck and Stevie Ray Vaughan, and I love Jeff Beck and had the same experience. Jeff Beck was brilliant with the guitar in his hand. Stevie Ray Vaughan just came out and put a whooping on us. And, and that was great. And that was what we remember. It is what you walk away going, wow, I'll never forget the way that felt.
Yeah. No, it's really important. No, Jeff Beck, wow. I saw him at Ronnie Scott's, which is like a pretty small, relatively speaking, jazz club in London. And I was sitting kind of like, it's like where my hi-fi is here. Sort of thing. I was like, his amplifier was literally 10 feet away from me, sort of thing, and it was the loudest thing I've ever heard in my life, but it wasn't painful, it was just exhilarating, and he just played the hell out of everything that he touched, it was just, and I think playing in that small environment suited him really well temperamentally and stuff. It was just amazing. He is a god, and I think all guitarists ultimately think he has that mixture of technique and emotion in his playing. It's just an incredible thing to see.
Yeah, and he plays with his entire hands.
Absolutely, every little bit of it, both hands. Yeah.
So you are going to tour Electro-Acoustic 2020.
I would love to.
You have some dates lined up so far?
Well, we have some in the UK. Yeah, so we have some gigs planned in mid-September, by which time I hope that the restrictions will be lifted and we can just be able to do those gigs. So there's one in London. You can see it on my website, which is www.jackhues.com. So rather than trying to go through it all here, but yeah, if you're in the UK, come and see us. And obviously, if there were opportunities to play some stuff in the States next year or whatever, I would love them, because I think American audiences would dig the music and dig the band and dig the way that live there's a certain amount of improvisation and a slightly more, if you like, sort of jazzy slant to things than there is on the records.
I know that there was
I'd love to see you at a House of Blues somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. It would be wonderful to do that.
Hollywood Bowl. Let's get him in the bowl. Love that venue.
Yes.
Shows are selling out right now. Shows are selling out in the United States. California just opened today. Like we're open for business again. So
Fantastic.
get out here. Let us spend some money on you.
Yeah, I'd love that. Yeah, well, we should. Yeah. I mean, things are still kind of shut down here. It's better than it was, much better than it was. But music is still very restricted. Music, theatre, all the important things in life, you know, you still can't do. So hopefully that will all stop in July then. And then we just got to be able to sort of travel to other countries, which seems to be another big hurdle to get over. But I guess, you know, I get we've all got to be careful and stuff. But yeah, I really can't wait to be able to travel to the States again. I miss it a lot, actually.
Anything in closing, John? Jack? Anything?
Well, this has been fun, really great, and I really appreciate you listening to Electro-Acoustic Works, and we've got to work together and all that stuff. And yeah, I hope you guys really get into the album when it comes out. I'll send you advance copies as soon as I get one. So